In this video, we're going to edit a digital raw image from start to finish. We'll begin with this, and we'll finish with this. Stick around. How's it going, everyone? Always a pleasure to see you. A couple of important points before we start the edit. The first thing I want to mention is that everything that I'm going to do today will be in Capture One. Now, if you happen to use Adobe Lightroom, don't worry, because all of the tools and techniques that I'll be demonstrating in Capture One are applicable to Adobe Lightroom as well. They just may be labeled something different. They may be called something different or look a little bit different in the Lightroom interface. But by and large, everything you see here is available in Lightroom as well. Second thing, this video is not about how to get a particular style or look, but rather just to stress the importance of following a framework, of having some type of outline and structure in your raw processing workflow. Because to be totally honest, I had no structure. A number of years ago, back when I first started editing raw images, I would just jump in and move a bunch of sliders around and kind of hope for the best. But the thing that I learned over time, the thing that I really began to appreciate, was the importance of having some structure, of knowing not just where to start and what to do next, but what order you should be editing in. When all the world's your oyster and when you have so many options available to you, where do you start? Right? I mean, because you want to be progressively enhancing your image. You want to build a strong foundation first and then be building layers and levels on top of that. So what I hope to do in this video is to stress the importance of that and to demonstrate for you how it works and to demonstrate for you how I do it, in the hopes that perhaps you will find inspiration in it and find some ways to apply it to your own processing workflow as well. So let's jump into Capture One and start editing. All right, so here we are in Capture One. Now, if you're curious to know more about this image and where it was shot, because we are going to be looking at it for a few minutes here, this photograph was captured back in 2017 in a tiny little historic medieval village in Italy named Pitigliano. Now, if you've never heard of Pitigliano before, I wouldn't be surprised. It's this walled fortress of a village. I mean, there's, I think, maybe only about 100 people who live there now. And they call it Little Jerusalem because it has a rather large Jewish population that lives there. We were there because I was there on holiday with my wife and kids, and we were doing a whole trip down the western seaboard of Italy, where we started in Genoa in the north and then worked our way south to the Amalfi Coast in the south. And along the way, we stopped in various places. And one of the places we spent a night was in Pitigliano. And Pitigliano was so fascinating to get out and to explore and to wander and to look around in all these little nooks and crannies and alleyways. And speaking of the photograph, I mean, the image was shot using a Leica M-P rangefinder. Awesome, awesome camera. I actually don't own it anymore. I ended up selling it because after this trip, I wasn't using the camera as much, and it was spending too much time on the shelf, to be honest. I didn't want to hold on to it too long because I was afraid of the resale value going down, especially once newer cameras came out, so I decided to let it go. But such an awesome little camera because there's no Leica logo on it. It's one of those variants that Leica creates where they intentionally take their branding off of the camera, which is great because especially when you're out doing street photography and travel photography and stuff like this, you don't really want to be advertising the camera that you're using, right? And that's something that I loved about that Leica, and the images that it made. The images that it created were just fantastic. I kept the lens. I mean, this was shot with a 35mm Summilux lens. My intent is to someday pick up a new body and to pick up where I left off and be using that lens again. But for now, that camera has a new home, so I just have the old photographs. So that should tell you more about where it is and what I use to capture it. So let's start editing. All right, so the first step is to edit lens corrections. Now, if I come over here to the profile and take a look, you can see that these are all the lens profiles that Capture One has built into it. And it inferred from the metadata of the photo that I'm using one of these Leica lenses here. It automatically checked chromatic aberration, not a big deal. Doesn't really hurt anything in the image. I don't think there is any chromatic aberration, so I'll just leave it on. Then the next three sliders are distortion, sharpness, and light fall off. Now, distortion is pincushion distortion. How much or how little distortion you have is entirely dependent on focal length. My general philosophy on distortion and lens corrections in general is to just kind of decide for yourself whether you like the abnormalities that are contributed by the lens. Sometimes that gives it character. Sometimes imperfect is better than perfect. Now, sharpness is something that's unique to Capture One. What it does is apply additional sharpness to the corners to account for any softening that may have occurred down here. Because, I mean, some of this is attributed to depth of field, I think. So I don't feel like sharpness is really going to do all that much for this image. There's really nothing in the corners that I want to be drawing attention to anyway. So I'm not going to bring up sharpness. Light fall off. So this is essentially vignette. It's just called light fall off in Capture One. I think part of the reason they do that is because in Lightroom, as you probably know, there are like 3 different sliders named vignette. It can get kind of confusing, I think, which one does what. Now, again, light distortion, maybe you like that. Maybe you're cool with the vignette and you want that natural vignette in the image. But one of the things I know about this image, because I don't like this corner down here in the lower right-hand side of it, this little edge is really distracting to me. I am going to be doing some cropping. And anytime you crop an image, you should be applying your own vignette and not using the natural vignette. Because when you keep the natural vignette, then you are cropping into it, which makes it kind of out of balance. I'm going to remove the vignette, but then we're going to bring it back later. So I just bring this up until it looks like I'm looking at the wall over here on the left-hand side. I'm just bringing it up until that lower left-hand corner looks the same as the rest of the wall. And right around there looks good. Basically, you just push this until it seems unnatural. See, that's a little bright. And then you just bring it back, and right about there looks right. All right, the next step is to crop the image. Now, as I said earlier, this little edge on the side of the stairwell here is rather annoying. So we're just going to bring this up from the bottom to get rid of that. Maybe bring it in a little bit from the top too. And yeah, see what's happening with the stairs now? See, that edge is now gone, so the line now runs out of frame, and your eye doesn't get hung up on that anymore. I think that looks much, much better. All right, the next step is to edit white balance. Now, this is a critical step, I think, in your overall workflow, because this is really the moment in which you're starting to shift from just making technical edits, like correcting some of the technical issues with the lens, and now you're really starting to think about what is it that you want to achieve creatively with the image? What is it that is in your mind's eye when you're thinking about what is the net result of the photo? When I think about this moment and when I remember being there, I remember being warm, it was sunny, it was late in the afternoon. To me, it feels like a summer image, like something that should be warm, something that should be crunchy, something that should have a bit of bite to it when it comes to the contrast, because we can. And I think the more of that it has, I think the more visually interesting it'll be. So let's begin by editing the white balance. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add just a little bit of warmth to the image. Not so much that it starts to turn orange like this, right? I mean, that's just too much. This is the default white balance. This is as shot here, but I'm just going to warm it up a little bit. I'm just going to bring this up, and you can see what's happening with this yellow wall back here, right? I mean, it's starting to glow a little bit. It's starting to get some of that color. So somewhere right around there, I think looks really good. All right, the next thing we're going to tackle is exposure. Now, this is obviously a really big and important step during the process. You might end up spending a fair amount of time here. First thing that I like to do is come up here to the histogram and take a look at it and just see what's going on with the image, because your eyes may deceive you, and the histogram doesn't lie. I mean, you can look at it and you can see exactly what's going on with the tonal range of the image. Unfortunately, with this one, I mean, there's no clipping. The blacks are good, the whites are good, and most of the information is right across the middle of it, which means that it was well exposed, and we have a lot of information here to be working with. Pretty happy with that. I do think it's like a touch underexposed, and this is something that I talked about in my framework video, but part of what I like to do, it's almost like an accordion of sorts. Like you kind of want to bring everything in and just be, kind of bringing things towards the center of the histogram and then start stretching them back out again in order to be creating contrast. So what I'm going to do is raise the exposure slider here just a little bit, just to bring in a little extra light so that we're pushing the histogram to the right and kind of filling in some of this gap over here on the right side of it. And right around there, I think looks right. Now, I'm not going to mess with contrast because I'm going to be doing that in the tone curve and the levels. Saturation, definitely not. Saturation you save for color, because when you start making exposure edits and start applying contrast, saturation is affected as well. You inject more saturation when you apply contrast. So a lot of times you don't even need to mess with saturation. Definitely do exposure first. All right, now we move on to what Capture One calls the high dynamic range. And this is where you have highlights and shadows and whites and blacks. And this should look familiar to Lightroom if you're a Lightroom user. Now, here's something that's really interesting about Capture One. And this is one of the reasons why I ended up changing over to it, is because the highlight slider, it has almost like this intelligence to it in Capture One that I just like a lot better compared to how highlights work in Lightroom, which tend to be a little more aggressive. You can see what's happening here, right? I mean, when I bring that highlight slider up and down, it's targeting the right side of the image over here, and it's not affecting the left side. It's not harming any of the other luminosity values. It knows exactly where this should be applied, and it's over there on the left hand or on the right hand side. So I'm just going to bring this thing all the way down to -100. And sometimes if you go like -100 in Lightroom, it's way too much. But here, it's just right. And it made the right side of the image more tonally balanced with the left. They feel more even now. Exposure editing in general, for me, is just a way of kind of normalizing the light so that there isn't anything that is obviously overly bright or too dark. And you're basically bringing some things down, you're bringing other things up, and just trying to get a smooth roll off of value from one side of the image to the other so that it's not too distracting. We're still kind of in a fixing phase here as opposed to adding the look that we're going for. So I dropped highlights all the way down. Let's see what's going on with shadows. So I'm going to bring this down. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I'm going to mess with shadows too much. I think the information we have is good. Whites, maybe bring that down just a touch. Now, the next step is levels. Now, levels, this panel does not exist in Lightroom, but if you use Photoshop, you will recognize this. It's basically the same as what you find there, and in that you have like your black point, your white point, and your midpoint here. And your values, black is 0 and white is 255. These are the input and output values for your black point and your white point in your image. I don't like for anything to be pure black. Look at the histogram up at the top of the right column, right? See what's happening when I adjust that black point? It's pushing in the histogram from the left side and pulling it away from that pure black 0 value. By bringing up the black point a little bit, you're creating a little more detail. And it's also, I think, giving it a slightly flatter, kind of more of like a matte film look anyway. You can also do the same with the white point up here. You could bring that down if you wanted to, but there's so little information up there that it's not really helping any. So I'm just going to leave it right where it is. I am, though, going to bring up the midpoint some, which is going to bring a little more light into the midtones of the image. And as you can see up here at the top in the histogram, pushing this midpoint to the left pushes the histogram to the right. It's pushing more of those darker pixels towards the right side, and it goes in the reverse if I push it this way. So I'm just trying to bring the histogram into the center so that it's not too dominant down on the left side, just so that then I have some better material to be playing with when applying contrast. All right, so speaking of contrast, now is the time to do that. And to do that, I'm going to use the tone curve. Now, the tone curve, when you make edits here, it is within the black point and the white point and the midpoint that is set by levels. I'm going to create a midpoint here just so that we're locking down the midpoint so that we're not adversely affecting it. And then I'm going to bring the shadows down. Now, notice what's happening here is that not only are the shadows getting deeper, but the colors are getting richer, right? I mean, this gets back to the point I was talking about a minute ago about saturation, where you don't need to be adding saturation because when you start adding contrast, you're going to inject saturation just by doing that. And yeah, I think that's good right there. So let's just take a quick look at where we are. So here's the before and after. This is the after. This is the before. I mean, as you can see, we've come a long way already. I mean, big changes just through very, very slight edits to exposure and to levels and to curves. And that's it. I mean, it doesn't really require all that much. All right, the next thing that I want to do with regards to exposure is continue to address this right side of the image because it's a little hot. It's still a little distracting, even though I brought those highlights all the way down. I wanted to kind of match the look of this wall over here and not be as bright. It's also a little bit cool in temperature. So how are we going to fix that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to use an adjustment layer. Now, Capture One has layers. Lightroom does not, and that's one of the cool things about Capture One, in my opinion. So I'm going to use the gradient mask tool here. Now, Lightroom has this as well. It's just, kind of designed a little bit differently. I'm going to bring this in, kind of mimicking the direction of the light coming down at an angle like this. So it looks somewhat natural. And bring it in right about there. And then I'm going to bring down the exposure. So as you can see, right, I mean, it's bringing down that right side. And now tonally, it's getting in the ballpark of what we have over here on the left side. Don't want to go too dark with it, but that looks about right there. Now, the other thing I noticed is that because of how the light was hitting it, it doesn't have like the same kind of contrast or kind of crunchiness that the left side of the image does over here. And what we can do then is just bring up the contrast slider there. And I think right around there is looking good. See how like this area of the wall here is now looking kind of similar to this over here. Now notice how the tone of yellow here is different than the tone of yellow over here. It's a little more orange, a little bit warmer over here because of the light. So what I'm going to do is now use color temperature. Bring up the color temperature some. Gonna keep pushing it, Now the stairs and the right side of the image is looking closer to the left. And there we go. Okay, so I can turn that adjustment layer on and off. Right? I mean, it's one of these things that you don't really notice while you're editing, and then you turn it on and off, and you're like, oh man. Wow. Yeah, that really did help a lot. Now just while I'm here, I want to point something out that one of the cool things about layers in Capture One is that you can pop this into a layer and then you have an opacity slider, just like Photoshop. So you can pull this up and down. And like if you went too hot with it and you just want to pull this back, you can absolutely do that just like you do in Photoshop. So again, we're editing exposure here. This isn't a dodging and burning step. I actually may have gone a little too hot with the contrast. I mean, what we're still just trying to equalize some of the light is the main goal here. And I think we're looking pretty good. Okay, now when you make these edits in a layer, you have to remember to click back to background in order to get back to where you were before. Sometimes I forget and I start making edits in the adjustment layer. Oh, this actually reminds me. I should name this thing. So we're going to name it Burn Top Right so that I know what it is and what's going on there. Okay, now there is definitely some additional dodging and burning that I would like to do, but I'm going to save that for a little bit later because there's some other, because right now with exposure, you're just trying to equalize it and balance things out. You're not going crazy with it. So next we're going to focus on color. So let's switch over to the color here. What I typically like to start with in Capture One, I like to split tone. This is one of the nice interfaces in Capture One that is coming actually to Lightroom in an update soon. It's these very like video-centric kind of color wheels, which are great because then you can see the relationships between colors. I'm going to warm up the highlights a little bit. Just bring some extra warmth into there. And then I'm going to contrast that with some blue, some cyan blue in the shadows. Now let's go to the color editor panel, another really nice editor here. Now what I'm going to do here is bring yellow closer to orange so that it just feels a little bit warmer and so that we are kind of collapsing the yellows and the reds together a little bit. Yellows, oranges, and reds. I'm going to bring up the saturation I think that looks about right. Now, one of the things you can do to see your edits is just within a particular panel is to hold down the Option key and then click on the reset icon, and it just does a temporary reset of what you did. It doesn't reset the panel all the way back. As you can see, we created a little more warmth, a little more life in that yellow. All right, let's take a look at blue. Now, blue, there is some definite blue here in this tire here. Now, I also think I'm going to bring down its saturation some too, just so that it's not too prominent. All right, so overall, I am pretty happy with the color and the exposure. And if we take a look at the before and after, I mean, this is where we are. I think we're looking pretty good. Okay, so now this is where you can really start to dial in some of that mood and atmosphere that you're looking for. Dodging and burning, I think, is such an important step. But before I just start drawing gradient maps on top of here, I want to explain what the goal here is. So one of the things I want to do is just help shape and give some direction to the light. Because right now, the light's just kind of bouncing all over the place in here. Everything is kind of on an even plane. What I want is to bring out the subject. I want to bring out the center of the image. I want to bring out the bike a little bit. Burn left. So we're going to burn the left side over here. And I'm just kind of, trying to go along with the contour of the wall here. And see what's happening? See, the value now of that left wall is very much, it's going down. It's definitely getting darker and it's looking better. See, that's the after, before, after, before. I may have gone a little too hot with it, so I'll bring that up some. Now what I want to do is, well, one of the things is definitely this floor down here. This floor has been driving me crazy. So let's just go ahead and take care of that. So I'm going to burn. And this is something that you will find oftentimes is that the ground, because it's flat in relation to the sun, that the ground will be brighter than your subject. And if you go too dark with it, I think it looks unnatural, but you typically don't want it to be the brightest thing in your image because it's not the subject. It's not what you want people to see. So I'm just going to bring this down a little bit. And I think that is looking a lot better. See, that's the before, after, before, after. Again, right now, I mean, we can finesse this. We can make some additional edits to it, but I just want to bring the values down a little bit. Just for now, because we can keep creating layers. All right, I'm going to do one in the top right now. I'm going to burn top right. And what I'm doing here, see how you have this angle of the stairs that's coming down this way? There's kind of this implied diagonal, I feel like, that's being created here because the light's coming from the top right. Let's just see what happens. So I'm going to bring this down a little bit, and let's turn this on and off. Take a look at it. Yeah, right? I think this area over here may be a little too dark now because now we have overlapping gradients. So I'm just going to bring that up some. Okay, so now that we've pretty well equalized some of the dodging and burning, what I want to do is bring a little more attention to my subject here in the center. To do that, I mean, we could either use the vignette tool, and we could bring in a little bit of vignette, and that's entirely doable. And I'll probably end up doing that here in a minute. Because remember, we removed it, right, from the edges, and it could use a little bit more. So what I'm going to do here is let's just add a little bit of punch in the center of the image. So I'm going to call this Dodge Center. And obviously, in the center of the circle, this is where the effect will be most pronounced, and then it'll fade off out here towards the edges. And the more feather you have, the more natural it looks. So now that we have the mask in the middle, our radial, I'm just going to bring up the exposure slider. I'm actually brightening the outside of the circle. So I need to right click on the mask, invert it, and boom. And now it's in the middle. Let's just do a gut check here. Let me see where we're at. Before, after, before, after. All right, before I move on, there's something I noticed in here that's starting to make my eye twitch a little bit. And that is the fact that, so you have this light over here on the right side is just there's like a little bit of magenta in it compared to the left side. It's like greener on the left than it is on the right. And yeah, that definitely looks better. All right, before we move on from dodging and burning, there's one more I want to do here. I want to burn the top left. Maybe rotate it up some. So let's go back to our background layer here. Now, the next thing I want to do is, because I kind of skipped this step earlier, but I think this is a really good step to save for later, and that is to add in a little bit of clarity and a little bit of structure. Now, structure is now something, well, I guess it's called texture in Lightroom. It's more of a recent tool, but this is something that, and I'm going to zoom in here so that you can see what it does. This is something that brings out some of those fine details in the image. If I just start turning this thing up, you can see what's happening. I mean, it's applying like micro contrast. It's like very, I mean, you can really see those edges of like the darkening and the brightening that's going on. Now, clarity is targeted contrast towards the midtones in the image, which we have a fair amount of. So we're going to stretch out the midtones some. Don't want to go too crazy with this because then it just starts getting kind of crunchy. But I think right around there looks good. Now I think is a good time to be applying some vignette on top of it, because now we've cropped the image, we've done everything, and now I just want to bring a little less attention to these corners down here. All right, now that I'm looking at the vignette, I'm just going to pop up the contrast maybe a little bit, just to give it some little more life in the lights. Yep. Okay. So now we have clarity, we have structure, we have vignette. Things are looking good. Now that you have your image pretty well finalized, you have things where you want them, your color and your exposure and all of that. Now is a really good time to be thinking about what is it about the image that bugs you? Is there anything in here that is distracting, that's been making you crazy? Let me just make a cleanup layer here just to demonstrate this. One of the things that's been bugging me this entire video is this little clump down here in the lower right. It's just kind of distracting to the eye. I don't particularly like it. So just trying to make this look as natural as possible. This is also a good time to be looking around the edges of the image. Is there anything that's kind of hanging towards the edge, which is making your eye twitch a little bit? Like I'm looking at this now, and now I see this over here, and I'm like, it's a little close to the edge. And when something like that is close to the edge of the frame, it kind of pulls your eye over there, and you start to notice little abnormalities like that. Okay, so I think that does a good job. Now, obviously, you can spend all day doing this, but the point here is that cleanup, this is the time you do it right here at the end. All right. Now the next step is sharpening. This is the final step of the image. Now, sharpening, I mean, there's kind of like two ways of thinking about it. I mean, you can sharpen your baseline image if you want to. You know, you can come in here and apply, I think I have some presets in here for sharpening. I like the pre-sharpening ones. I think they're pretty good. So you can either apply sharpening, you know, at the raw level, or you can open the image in Photoshop and then be applying sharpening on export, which I think is a little more precise. Just for the sake of completing the image, I will go ahead and apply some sharpening here. So I think we are pretty much done with this image. This is the before. I mean, it's hard to believe that's where we started, isn't it? That's where we started a long time ago. And now that's the after. Before, after. All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. I apologize if it went on a bit longer than what you expected, but you know, I mean, I'm literally editing this, you know, step by step incrementally and second guessing myself in the decisions I'm making. So hopefully it didn't drag on too long, but I hope in general that you learned something new from it, that perhaps you have a better understanding of what I'm talking about when I talk about editing in a series of incremental steps progressively over time, starting with one thing, starting with the foundation layer of your house and then slowly building levels on top of that. Start broad and then almost like the shape of a triangle. You start broad and then you just slowly get more specific, more granular as you go. And you are incrementally and progressively enhancing that image and improving it and making it better over time. And then every now and then, if you need to backtrack and fix a little something, that's totally cool too. But the idea here in general is just to get in this habit and develop some type of framework for yourself, whether it's the one that I'm recommending or one that works for you. Then you will get more consistent results with your photography, more consistent results with your editing, and you'll get a little less kind of stuck in the weeds, a little less lost, and which can happen sometimes if you're not exactly sure what to do next and where it is that you're going. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you would like to see more editing videos like this in the future, please leave me a comment. Please let me know. If you haven't already subscribed to this channel, also do that. If you are into photography, if you're into this topic, and you want to see more videos from me, and then you know what to do. Then hit the subscribe button, and we'll keep in touch with each other in the future. Thanks so much, everyone, for hanging out with me. I appreciate it. Had a good time. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next week.